Many historians of art like to identify works that mark the transition from one historical period to another. Whether it's the symphonies of Beethoven or the novels of James Joyce, there are any number of works where a historian might say things were different after this. Today we're going to look at 3 closely related RPGs to see how they show clear evidence of a historical transition. Those games are the PC classic Wasteland and the first 2 Fallout titles. The difference between Wasteland and its spiritual successors is telling, as you might expect, but even the difference between the 2 Fallout games is remarkable. Even though they were only released a year apart, the difference between them still reflects an industry-wide evolution that was taking place at the time. Additionally, we'll briefly examine the way the Fallout games reveal changing cultural attitudes in the way they revised the setting and tone of Wasteland. The vastly more famous Fallout series was preceded by an earlier post-apocalyptic RPG called Wasteland. Wasteland's director, Brian Fargo, called the game a combination of Ultima and The Bard's Tale, the latter of which he produced. The resemblance to both games is pretty clear, as you can see, but except for the innovative combination of the Ultima-style overworld and the Bard's Tale-style interface and local maps, the game didn't pioneer any new features. Instead, it was well received because of its innovative setting. In a time when most RPGs were set in a Tolkien-esque fantasy world, Wasteland took the Mad Max movies as inspiration. It didn't spend much time meditating on the systematic causes of global apocalypse or the Lost World's cultural legacy, but instead focused on day-to-day survival in a brutal land. This might be because both Wasteland and Mad Max were created during the Cold War, when it seemed like the Soviet Union might linger indefinitely. Whatever the reason, Wasteland's descendants would approach the same idea with a very different attitude. A little less than 10 years later, the first Fallout game came out, and it was clear just how much had changed in PC RPGs. Whereas Wasteland had emerged into a golden age of PC RPGs, Fallout found itself in a marketplace full of first-person shooters. Beyond that, games and the machines they ran on had evolved enormously. Fallout looks better and has a lot more content than Wasteland because it was technologically possible to have those things. But it would be easy to overlook the other changes, like the proper integration of a mouse. Players no longer have to move one tile at a time, and indeed, Fallout has a robust system for managing turn-based gameplay across variable distances. But a general improvement in usability and user experience is the biggest change. PC RPGs of the 1980s and early 1990s required the player to memorize, or at least frequently consult, large parts of the instruction manual in order to understand what was possible in a game and how to use various features. These features had no standard design or control scheme, and they were often deeply unintuitive. In the second half of the 1990s, games began to evolve out of these unwieldy habits. First, some game professionals had amassed 2 decades of experience by the late 1990s, and that led to a natural improvement in the products they made. Second, programmers and designers with commercial software experience began to enter the video games industry, bringing with them a variety of techniques for improving user experience. Third, the audience for video games was growing explosively, and to capture that market, game creators had to deliberately design their games with a broader audience in mind. Compared to Wasteland, Fallout is a big improvement along most of these lines. Indeed, you can see just how rapid the evolution of user experience was in the field of games by looking at the usability improvements between Fallout 1 and Fallout 2. The latter came out only a little more than a year after the first game, and yet had significant usability improvements. There's a subtle difference between Fallout and Wasteland, however, and I think it's a much more interesting one. Fallout tackles most of the same subject matter as Wasteland, and yet the 2 games approach that subject matter with different tones. As I mentioned, Wasteland is mostly concerned with the moment-to-moment life of survivors in the post-apocalyptic world. There are some absurd and grandiose things that happen, and sometimes those things are played for laughs, but generally, there's a sense that the institution that governs the wastes, the Desert Rangers, is necessary and functional, if not benevolent. Fallout approaches a similar setting from a perspective of deep mistrust and disaffection. The first game begins with a bitterly ironic propaganda video made by an absurdly jingoistic government. As you explore the game's iconic vaults, you acquire even more evidence that pre-war institutions were outright contemptuous of human life. The few post-apocalyptic institutions aren't much better. To a large degree, this reflects the contrasting views of the Cold War before and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Once nuclear war was no longer a real threat, the politics and cultural attitudes that prevailed in the Cold War seemed absurd or even barbarous. And those changing feelings are a major source of the bleak humor for which Fallout is famous. It's not every day that we can use video games as a window into how a culture views its own history, but the difference between Fallout and Wasteland gives us an enlightening glimpse. The games also give us a great look at the revolution in user experience that started in the mid-1990s. Commercial software development practices, larger staffs, larger budgets, and most importantly larger audiences changed the way that video games were made. And in these games, we get a great look at that process both in the long and short terms. Of course, that process isn't over. Modern RPGs continue to be streamlined in ways that would have seemed almost like magic to the first generation of digital RPG designers. Today, developers and designers continue to push towards the kind of seamless experiences that were once only possible in the imaginations of tabletop role players.